Alright everybody, so today's date is May 22nd, 2024. And you probably remember 2 years ago, I made a series following up on the popularity of films I should have talked about years ago. A series of its own known as Films I'm Willing to Talk About Again, where instead of talking about films that I could have talked about any point in time, like when they were new and thereby relevant, I chose to talk about a lot of old movies, as well as newer movies, all at one time. But films I'm willing to talk about again circumnavigated films that I have previously talked about, like Toy Story, El Dorado, and many more. So, a little more than 2 years have gone by since I first made that whole thing worthwhile, and now I'm gonna give a second shot at it. So here we go, season 2 of Films I'm Willing to Talk About Again, because there are lots of things that I have talked about before, and well, it's 2024, and as of March of this year, Ghostbusters. Well, not that. No, Frozen Empire is something I could save for another time because it's not as relevant right now. However, this is, after all, the 40th anniversary of Ghostbusters. Yes, so we're talking about the original here. So, 40 years of Ghostbusting, 40 years of Ivan Reitman at his finest, 40 years of the likes of Harold Ramis, Bill Murray, Dan Aykroyd, and Ernie Hudson, all with their iconic Ghostbusting attire and unique equipment. This is, after all, known as the greatest supernatural comedy of all time. And well, even after 4 straight decades, in a similar regard to how other franchises that started that year, like Transformers, The Terminator, and even Ninja Turtles started around that time as well. In the form of comics, not as movies or even the TV show. No, because that was later. Anyways though, Ghostbusters is basically what you think it is. This was another project that was done by the likes of Dan Aykroyd, Bill Murray, and Harold Ramis, because they have, in fact, been in Hollywood-style films before. In 1981, for instance, Ramis and Murray both portrayed themselves, as well as did work, on a film called Stripes, which you could say was a precursor to the likes of other military films like Major Payne, Forrest Gump, and even the iconic Full Metal Jacket in 1987. But wouldn't you know, Ghostbusters was the first true film that was made possible by the likes of Harold Ramis and Bill Murray, although they had Dan Aykroyd help with the project as well. Ivan Reitman, of course, was put together for the directing position, and boy did he deliver. Even to this very day, he practically made the series what it is today. A franchise that had never possibly faltered. Well, unless you want to count a few bumps in the road that took place in the past decade. But that was a whole different subject that I'm glad I got out of the way. So, anywho, the plot of this movie revolves around 4 people, 4 different professionals. You have Dan Aykroyd, who plays as a famous psychologist known as Dr. Peter Venkman. He's out there performing a supposed negative reinforcement test involving 2 subjects. 2 clients of his, with one being tested on what flashcards he's holding, and the other trying to guess what shape he's holding. The unfortunate thing, though, is that there's a catch. You have Venkman himself zapping the guy repeatedly, which alone is pretty hilarious. But to add insult to injury, he doesn't bother showing which cards are incorrect and which cards are correct. So whomever got it right or wrong didn't exactly matter, because the whole purpose of this was to find out what kind of limits the guy himself could have. And that's basically the whole epitome of negative reinforcement in a nutshell. It goes to the point where he just scrams without saying anything more. So then, of course, you have Dr. Egon Spengler, whom is a field scientist whom has been known for the study of ectology, which of course is in direct relation to ghosts. And then of course, there's Dan Aykroyd's character, Ray Stantz, who himself looks forward to a future with his two pals, Venkman and Spengler. All three of whom investigate a series of conundrums that are taking place within New York City. After all, a recent incident that went down involved a haunted library, where basically a librarian is spooked to death, with the iconic intro and title sequence made possible thanks to popular pop artist Ray Parker Jr. Yeah, his iconic Ghostbusters theme has never once lost track. Anyways, the library is filled with all sorts of crap in there. You have cards flung all over the place, filing cabinets that have been randomly opened, shot stuff into the air. You have ectoplasm randomly hung on various spots in the room. And to top it all off, there's a ghost in the room. A ghost that ends up getting captured. A ghost that's brought in for study. A ghost that is, in fact, found to be of supernatural origins. And what do the three do? Well, it's quite simple, really. They decide to formulate their own group that connects with the likes of Ecto Containment. They simply call themselves the Ghostbusters. This job, of course, also does involve a secretary, a friend of theirs named Janine Melnitz, whom is, of course, played by the one and only Annie Potts. The same Annie Potts whom would eventually play Bo Peep in Toy Story, as well as a few other roles, even young Sheldon. But this was, of course, a while before any of that happened. Anywho, the four basically get together, open up a firehouse to serve for their own headquarters. They eventually get their hands on a car as well to provide themselves with transport, but to also act as their official vehicle registered for the business itself. After all, you got fire, you got police, you got ambulances, and now you have another vehicle equipped with sirens as well as horns. Ecto 1. Built off the backs of a heavily modified 1959 Cadillac ambulance, which was supposedly sent for scrap. The Ecto 1 has certainly become one of the most insanely well-designed and iconic cars ever used in film history. Up there with the likes of the DeLorean from Back to the Future, or even the famous dog van from Dumb and Dumber. Plus many others. But Ecto 1 sure did stand out from the bunch. It served as a mode of transportation, a mode of containment, a mode of backup for the power of their proton packs, which were powerful. Very powerful. So much so that when they get an assignment telling them that there is another disturbance similar to the library, Egon basically goes so far to explain to them not to cross the streams. As in, two ectoblasters firing at the same time, they're not to allow the beams to make contact with each other. Otherwise, total protonic reversal will occur. Life as they know it would just shatter in the blink of an eye. One could only imagine how well that would actually turn out for them. But in any case, they successfully capture the ghost, who turns out to be a small green ghost who's pretty much just feasting on the bunches of people's foods. They then, of course, arrange the payment. A $5,000 paycheck in 1984, which would certainly be equivalent to well over $50,000 today, which is still incredible, by all means. They charge that much money for one ghost capture. Yet they agree to pay up, which I cannot imagine having them come over to my place just because it's haunted, and they charge me a few $1,000s for it. Oh boy. But in all seriousness, things do eventually start to get into a bit of a turmoil. A newcomer comes by, Ernie Hudson himself, whom is known by his character name, at least in the film, Winston Zedmore. He becomes a trainee to the group and is welcomed by the other three with plenty of positivity in mind. Although Venkman, of course, has his own sheer disbelief, with a hint of pessimism in mind. I mean, that's just the likes of Bill Murray as we know it. After some time passes, though, Bill Murray himself, as we know, still known as Venkman in the film, he eventually gets together with a person known by the name of Dana Barrett, whom unfortunately has been acting up in a certain weird way. It turns out something had gone wrong in her own place. She apparently had been possessed. Possessed by a being who just so happened to exist inside her own refrigerator. Yeah, as weird as that might sound, I could probably not get any more weirder than, potentially speaking, a point where another person ends up possessed. This time, it's a guy known as Louis Tully, played by good old Rick Moranis. This, of course, was a while before Moranis himself would also become popular, but in any case, his role as Tully in the film was sure well cited. And after all, with the likes of Sigourney Weaver and Rick Moranis, their characters have a unique bond with each other. And there's a special reason for that. Because they're all possessed, apparently. The two are possessed because apparently, as we learn from a later scene, Rick Moranis' character himself, Tully, explains to the likes of Egon and Janine that he is Vince Clortho, Keymaster of Gozer. He goes so far to explain that Gozer the Traveler will come upon to the planet Earth in search of a new body. More specifically, the Traveler will take on a brand new form to initiate destruction on the entirety of New York City. One distinct night, at the top of a certain building, the gates will open. Vince Clortho and Zuul are the terror dogs, the guardians of Gozer themselves. It's hard exactly if Gozer was determined as a male or female, so it was a bit hard to take in at the time. But they were assured that Gozer was male, which wouldn't exactly be true. But anyways, Vince Clortho, of course, explains the various things that Gozer has done, including taking on two different forms, like a moving torb and a giant slore. These, of course, weren't exactly that perpetuative to the plot, but they did at least help build up some lore to some degree. Lore that eventually would be brought to life later on in the franchise. But for now, 1984's Ghostbusters, that kind of lore was just set off to the side. Pretty much as a series of notes for Egon to put together, and more importantly, for the others to eventually come to understand that the Keymaster is an important component to the likes of Gozer's master plans. And alongside Zuul, the other person, whom of course was Dana Barrett herself, possessed by the likes of Zuul's spirit. With the two put together at the top of the building, it eventually comes to a master fight, but not before some issues take place. You see, a government agent known as Walter Peck, played by Matthew Atherton, he comes into the Ghostbusters headquarters to discuss some certain environmental impacts. One might assume he is a member of the EPA. The same EPA that would eventually sabotage Springfield for The Simpsons. But that, of course, would be more than 20 years later. And that is an entirely different subject that I might do later on in this series. But anyways, he basically forces them to shut down the protection grid, causing the entirety of the headquarters to explode, releasing all the ghosts from the containment unit. They wreak havoc on the city, and eventually the Ghostbusters are sent to prison, supposedly for causing a massive explosion and violating the Environmental Protection Act. The same Environmental Protection Act that was made possible because of mass pollution, which occurred only years earlier. Anyways, they were able to get out of this after they convinced the judge, as well as the Pope, of whatever reason by any standards, that they should basically initiate a plan of their own. Gozer plans on destroying New York City by taking on a form of their very own. Meanwhile, the Ghostbusters are going to have a plan of their own to stop Gozer before they can cause any sort of havoc, alongside the Terror Dogs, and whatever Gozer brings along to the world. So they plan on going to that same building that those two terror dogs are at. They manage to get there, but not before some complications erupt. Earthquakes take place, the road falls apart, and the Ghostbusters are presumed dead after they fall into a crevice. Thankfully they get out, enter the building, go up 22 floors, and eventually find their way up to the top towards an atrium. An outside area that is in fact underneath a gazebo-like structure. The very top, which is similar to, in a way, to a penthouse, is actually where the gates are at. One thing about the building itself is that it was basically made by a cult architect known as Shandor. And that is something that they do discuss while in prison at one point. Shandor is responsible for designing the building and allowing for Gozer to basically enter through the real world from their own gateway. With the guidance of the terror dogs, Gozer is able to set foot on Earth. A not so hasty greeting by the Ghostbusters and a bit of a speech from Dan Aykroyd determined that Gozer had to fall back. So basically, a near-death experience for the Ghostbusters means they had to take this seriously. They get their proton packs, almost get Gozer in the dust, presumably making them disappear. But of course, this wasn't the end of it. Just because Gozer vanished didn't mean that they were defeated. No, this was just the beginning. Next thing you know, their spirit comes up from above, demanding that they select a certain form for the traveler to come down and wreak havoc on the city. Well, they try to empty their minds because they have one shot at this, but someone ends up spilling the beans to Gozer and allowing, get this, a giant marshmallow man to come down and stomp on the city. Basically, Ray Stantz tried to think of something that would be considered harmless, unable to cause any mass terror in the city of New York. Well, I'd say he had a pretty good option there. They could have thought of anything that would have been considered harmless. Like maybe a turtle. I guess that would have been like a Gamera ripoff by any means. But it would have been pretty funny nonetheless. Anyways though, it turns out the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man wasn't entirely as harmless as they figured. Because next thing you know, he comes up to try to take down the Ghostbusters. They fry him to a crisp. But he still tries to climb up the building after them anyways. That's when they reach for their final plan. Egon basically breaks free from his restrictions. Tells them that they're going to go all in, cross the streams, and close the gate permanently. With the power of their 4 beams combined into one massive unilateral piece of energy. It would cause it to overload and explode. That's exactly what they do. They manage to exceedingly do it. After that, they're covered in Stay Puft Marshmallow. They exit the building, a crowd cheers for them, and all sorts of crazy things take place as they leave once and for all. Triumphant, tired, and incredibly dirty. Not just from the marshmallow, but also from a lot of psychokinetic energy, or PKE for short. As I've discussed in my The Real Ghostbusters episode in TV shows that deserve the spotlight, they technically take place after the movie, but it doesn't happen until several episodes in. But it's not entirely canon, even though they try very hard to allow for the series to basically adapt from the movie and actually continue forward. And like some series as I've talked about in TV shows that deserve the spotlight, The Real Ghostbusters does a pretty good job at allowing for us to not only gain insight as to the events after the movie itself, but also many more original pieces that would have allowed the characters to gain additional mileage. But in any case, the movie was still one of the biggest box office hits ever. It basically thrived so well. It launched Columbia into stardom. And as we know, Columbia is a Sony company and not Universal. Some were kind of confused as to why there was a Ghostbusters placed there. Since it's not a Universal property, it's a Sony property, or Columbia, depending on which way you look at it. But in any case, this is the reason why I love Columbia Films. And it's not just Ghostbusters. There's plenty of others out there. There's the Equalizer trilogy, there's Zombieland, there's Stuart Little, and a ton of other great films that we've had over the past 40 plus years. And you know, I'm glad they're still thriving. And Sony really does have a good hand at these things, considering that they are already amazing for the PlayStation consoles, as well as for basically revolutionizing animation in their own unique way. However, these are entirely different subjects. And in terms of ranking the Ghostbusters movie itself, it's an exceptional masterpiece. But yet there are some things that practically do hold it back, since the franchise has managed to actually improve in certain ways. Despite some bumps in the road, we've basically come to a point where Frozen Empire is basically like that of a true sequel. I felt kind of ashamed to call out the last, ashamed to call out Ghostbusters Aftermath a disgrace. Because Frozen Empire really showed us what the franchise was still capable of doing. And with that, Ghostbusters gets a 9.8 out of 10.1. But of course, this isn't all in terms of Ghostbusters related material. I could probably cover the sequel next time, and eventually other things as well. Until any of that happens though, make sure to like, subscribe, comment, follow me wherever you can find me, and stay on the Hollywood side.
I want you, but I don't have you yet. I ain't got no tricks to be playing on you.